Military records are one of the other basic but important elements of genealogical research. They tell you about an important facet of an ancestor's life, his or her military service. And I cannot speak from experience from either being in the military or more, to the point being in a war. Any military veterans in the room? Okay, several. I am not like, I should have remembered Carol and Will are military. I've never been in the military or been through a war, so I don't know what it's like. But people that I know that have been in war, like Vietnam, it's life-changing. I knew a World War II vet. He couldn't talk about his World War II experience without getting choked up, because 6 weeks or so after he got sent from Russell, Kansas to France to the Battle of the Bulge in World War II as a second lieutenant, which he said they were going through like butter at that point. He and his squad of men got captured. He thought they were surrounded by a bunch of Germans, but it turns out it was just one lone German machine gunner, that they could have taken him out, but they didn't realize it. So Dr. Russell said, the best thing I can do to get us all out of here alive is surrender. And so they rode the war out in a series of German POW camps all over Europe. And since they were all married, instead of talking about girls, they swapped recipes. And then when they got back to America, they had a bake-off, and everybody told how the recipes came out. And he still had those little scraps of paper they had written down with those recipes. He had his German dog tags. He had a spoon with a fork with a swastika on the back of it. But what really choked him up is he had 2 letters from the War Department to his parents in Kansas saying he was missing in action. And this guy, he was fearless. He didn't often get emotional, but when he got emotional when he would talk about those letters. He would break up. So I don't know what that feels like, but it's obviously a very important and an important facet of an ancestor's life or a relative's life. And though military records are primarily interested in a person's military service, some military records do furnish additional genealogical information, such as the veteran's birth, death, spouse, and children, which we'll talk a little bit about as we go along. This slide is shows just some of the wars that Americans have served in over the past 337 or more years. We've been a colony and then a nation. All the way from King Philip's War, which is the earliest one I put, 1675 to 1676, all the way to Vietnam. I didn't list the ones after Vietnam. There are obviously a lot more. I should say what hopefully is obvious, that African Americans and even Native Americans in a lot of cases have served proudly in all of these wars, both as freedmen and as slaves. In the Civil War, as we'll see in a moment, African Americans fought on both sides. It may be sort of counterintuitive and a little shocking to think about African Americans supporting the Confederate war effort, but they did for a lot of different reasons. Native Americans too fought on both sides of the Civil War. I saw a movie not long ago, the Nicolas Cage movie, The Code Talkers, about the Navajo from the Southwest that worked with the codes that just drove the Japanese crazy because they could never crack them. So minorities in America have been participants in all the wars as well. And so with wars, as with other events, records are generated. Here are some types of military service records that we're going to talk about. The obvious one would be military service records, but we've also talked briefly about bounty land warrants. There are also Civil War veteran censuses. There were pension application files for most of the major wars, and then a little more recently, draft registration cards. And all of these are available to one degree or another for several of the wars. Of course, you could start off by talking about the colonial wars, which the colonial period is roughly 1607 to roughly 1774, right before the American Revolution ratchets up and we declare independence from the mother country. Service records of soldiers for the colonial period will be located in the various state and local archives rather than the National Archives, and they're very spotty. You might find them in some states or some counties in some states and not other ones. When available, colonial service records tend to provide more historical than actual genealogical information, usually only providing the soldier's name and the colonial unit or regiment in which he served, which is something. It's not nothing, but it's not as much as I'd like to have. But these records consist mainly of rosters, rolls, and lists, most of which have been published and are available in genealogical and historical libraries across America. We've got several upstairs, like for Virginia and some places like that. The library has some of these. For a complete list of what's available for each state, see the Source 3rd edition, which I've got on the table up there. Now, the Revolutionary War records, this is the big war that, well, it's one of the earliest wars that people really get interested in searching for records for, because there are a little bit better records for the American Revolution than there are a lot of the previous wars. Some of the original Revolutionary War service records were destroyed by fire, and that'll come up again in a minute with some of the World War I and II records. A lot of the World War I and II records. But the surviving records for the Revolutionary War are at the National Archives and Records Administration in Washington, D.C. These are compiled primarily from rosters and rolls of soldiers serving in the Continental Army, state lines, and militia units. These records contain much more genealogical information, such as name, rank, and military organization. Occasionally, they'll list the state from which the soldier served. Sometimes the date his name appears on various rolls, and also sometimes his dates of enlistment, and more rarely his date of discharge may be given. In some categories, they'll even include the soldier's physical description, his date and place of birth, his residence at enlistment, and other personal details. And they do that in the Civil War with the Civil War records. The 1840 federal population census was supposed to record all living Revolutionary War pensioners. But as we've seen already, it's not 100% by any stretch of the imagination, but it's definitely worth checking out. Revolutionary War records have been indexed in microfilm, and printed versions are available. You can order copies from the National Archives, and you can log on to their website and fill the form out online and send it in for a fee. Fold 3, which is a website, genealogy website that's in your handout of websites, and also in the military records handout, is a good website, subscription website that has Revolutionary records online. And of course, the library has Virgil D. White's Index to Revolutionary War service records and we'll talk about pension records in a minute. And that's not one of the ones I brought down. But I did bring several books on military service records down here. This is Virgil White's Index to War of 1812 pension application files, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. Now we'll talk a little bit about Revolutionary War pensions. Well, first of all, this is the part of the service record jacket for a man named Agrippa Hull, who was born in 1759 and died in 1848. He was born to Agrippa Hull was born to free people of color in Stockton, Massachusetts, and he was one of the most remarkable and unnoticed African Americans of the Revolutionary War era. He served for 6 years and 2 months in the 12th Massachusetts Infantry, Washington's Continental Army, which earned him a badge of honor for his extended service. But Hull's influence on shaping the abolitionist thought of Thaddeus Kosciuszko, the Polish military engineer for whom he served as an orderly for the last 50 months of the war, is really the hidden importance of this young black patriot. And I didn't know about him until I started putting this program together several years ago on military service records. Now, as I said, African Americans served on both sides of most of our wars, including the Revolutionary War. A lot of them served for the British. The British sort of gave inducements and dangled carrots out to entice slaves and free people of color into the British Army, like giving their freedom after if the UK won the war. Here's a book by Jeffrey J. Crow, The Black Experience in Revolutionary War, North Carolina. So you can get books like this that will help put your African American ancestors' Revolutionary War experience into context if he had one. And again, don't assume he was a patriot. He could have sided with the British. So we've got all ancestors that served on one side or the other. So now we're going to go to Revolutionary War pension files. Congress originally authorized payment of Revolutionary War pensions in 1776. However, the government didn't really start paying them out until 1789. The government can drag its foot, and it will, and it's been doing it for 200 years. Many applications were destroyed in fires in 1800, and then again in 1814. The 1814 fire was the fault of the British when they burned Washington, D.C., so you can't really blame that on the federal government. A partial record of earlier pensioners is included in congressional reports for the years 1792, 94, and 95. So if you can look at these congressional reports, you can get a partial record of earlier pensioners. Although pension applications were filed with the federal government, they were initiated in the various county courts of the states. Often a denial by the pension board led to a veteran petitioning Congress directly. You're not going to give me a pension? I'll write my congressman. Revolutionary War pension files contain much useful information, including the veteran's date and place of birth, spouse, names of heirs, company and regiment, summaries of his service, and sometimes pages from the family Bible were even torn out and submitted as evidence to prove the genealogical stuff that the guy had to prove. Excuse me. The library has Virgil D. White's genealogical abstracts of Revolutionary War pension files. Heritage Quest has Revolutionary War pension and bounty land warrants online. And it says footnote, it's fold 3 now, has service records online. And the 2 images are documents from my 4th great grandfather or 5th great grandfather, Vachel Imes, who served in the Revolutionary War out of Maryland and then in North Carolina. 1 tour from Maryland and 2 tours from North Carolina. And Vachel's pension application file has a lot of this type stuff, receipts. But then it also had his will as part of a copy of his will as part of his proof to the pension examiners or his widow, because he was deceased, that he was a veteran who did serve. I think Vachel filed and then he died before it was approved. So there's a document that he wrote, which is basically a chronological record, a brief overview of his Revolutionary War military service and some of the campaigns and engagements he was in. I don't think he actually ever participated in any major battles, but his widow did get a pension. And as Brian was saying, some of these record groups can contain alternate records. I didn't expect to find his will in his pension application file, but there it was. And I couldn't find it in Lauderdale County at the courthouse. So that was a gold mine, finding the will. Now, we've already talked a little bit about bounty land warrants. If you remember, these bounty land warrant application files relate to claims based on wartime service between 1775 and March 3rd, 1855. And again, rather than pension money, the federal government paid these veterans with land. If an ancestor served in the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, early Indian Wars, or the Mexican War, it's worth searching these pension application files. Bounty land records often contain documents similar to those in pension files with lots of genealogical information. Many of the bounty land application files relating to Revolutionary War in 1812 service have been combined with the pension files. And again, to receive a bounty land warrant, a veteran had to make an application and meet certain criteria. Here, his widow basically had to furnish proof to the pension examiners that he had served honorably in the U.S. military. Eventually, they 14 days honorable service. And you can order bounty land warrant files from the National Archives, but also Fold 3. Not Fold 3, but the Bureau of Land Management. Now we're going to talk briefly about War of 1812. Let's see. Did I skip something? I'll just briefly talk about War 1812, Indian Wars and Mexican War before we jump to Union Civil War records. The federal government has service records for the War of 1812, Indian Wars, and Mexican War. This war too has been indexed, or these records too have been microfilmed and indexed. The majority of the War of 1812 compiled service records are arranged by state or territory and then by unit. If a unit's official designation did not include the name of a state or territory, U.S. Rangers, Captain Booker's Company, etc., it will appear separately. Some rosters of some states like Ohio are online. Fold 3, as of when I put this handout together several years ago, was uploading a War of 1812 records. And at the time I put the handout together, they had Lake Erie in Mississippi, but they may be further along with that. Now we're going to talk a little bit about Civil War, which Civil War records are what get a lot of people interested in genealogy. Well, that and Revolutionary War. So this is the images for my great-great-grandfather, Francis Marion French Hollis. That's him in the photo. And he was a sergeant in Company B, 2nd Tennessee Mounted Infantry, United States. So Union service records generally contain enlistment papers, muster rolls, prisoner of war papers, death reports, etc. They usually, but not always, but usually 70% of the time, give a physical description of the soldier, his height, weight, eye color, etc., where and when he enlisted, where he was from, what his occupation was, where he was from. Union service records are kept at the National Archives. Fold 3 has service records for several Union and just about all of the Confederate states. Fold 3 does have all of the United States Colored Troop regiments online, so if you had an ancestor who served in the Union Army from the South, his records will be online. Ancestry has indexes to Civil War service and pension files. Civil War service records don't usually contain any information regarding the soldier's family. They're typically only concerned with his military service. And remember that the 1910 census recorded the survivors of the Union and Confederate Army and Navy. The 1930 census also listed Civil War vets. Why? Because there weren't that many of them left alive, and they wanted to know how many they had. So these are examples of Francis Marion Hollis' service records from Company B, 2nd Tennessee Mounted Infantry, USA, which just also happens to be the company and regiment that Mountain Tom Clark deserted from before he became an outlaw. And so this is the ancestor that my grandmother said was a bad man, and she didn't think I wanted to research him. I'm like, well, I got to take all of them. I'm sorry if he did anything bad, but I just want to know what he did.
Probably because he was a Yankee.
Well, she didn't know that. I don't think anybody at the time had remembered, just that he had done something and nobody liked him. He was bad, so we can just sweep him under the rug. Well, the Confederate service records are pretty much like the Union service records, although they're not always as comprehensive. They were compiled by the War Department beginning in 1903 from various and sundry sources. That's why they call them compiled service records. As John very well knows, who's the leader of our Civil War Roundtable, they had to comprise these Civil War records for the Confederates literally from everywhere after the war, from various and sundry sources, including the centralized military personnel records, which were turned over to the federal government by Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston. The compiled service records of a Confederate soldier will typically consist of one or more card abstracts and often one or more original documents like pay vouchers, requisition forms, an occasional letter, etc. Each card in a man's file is abstracted from original records such as Confederate muster rolls, returns, Union prison and parole records. If a guy got captured and sent to prison, they'll often tell you when and where he got captured and how long he was in prison. If he was absent or present at muster, when they took the roll, when and how much he was paid, if he was wounded and sent to hospital. However, due to the nature of these reports, many of these files are woefully incomplete. And for some of these guys, you will have a pretty good idea that he served, but there will not be service records. more than once I researched a guy who was a captain whose daughter was in the United Daughters of the Confederacy from Tuscumbia, and I could never find his service records. And I know he had to have them, but just the nature of the Confederate records, it's amazing we have what we have. The Alabama Department of Archives and History, ADAH, has an Alabama Civil War service card file created from 8x5 index cards that they maintained from the 1900s through 1892, which you can access from their website. Confederate service records are available from the ADAH, and Wallace State College's Regional and Family History Center has microfilm for Confederate service records. The library has the complete set of compiled Confederate service records for Alabama with a consolidated index on microfilm, but they don't make nearly as good images as you can get from Fold 3. We have a Fold 3 subscription, so if you've got a Confederate ancestor, they make much better copies from Fold 3 than they do the microfilm. If you've got a Union ancestor, it would be worth checking to see if the records are on Fold 3 to get a copy of that. If not, you might could order that from Wallace State or the federal government. Fold 3 we also have the 1907 and 1920 Alabama Confederate Veteran Census on microfilm, because several former Confederate states did censuses. Alabama actually did 3, and I think we've actually got all 3 of them. I know we've got the Lauderdale County 1907, then we've got the 1920, and I believe the 1930. These are also on Ancestry and Fold 3. Union service, we've already been through Union service records. So I mentioned Black Civil War service. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on some of these, but just to mention them. Black served in the Union and Confederate armies. Black Union soldiers will normally have service records just like the white guys, only they were, for the most part, limited to all black United States colored troop regiments. If you've ever seen the movie Glory with Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman and Matthew Broderick, it's one of my favorite movies. It's based on a true story. 54th Massachusetts was the first United States colored troop regiment. The enlisted men were black, and the officers were white. So if you had and there were about 120 men from Lauderdale County, slave and free, mostly slaves, because the Union Army sent recruiters behind southern lines to recruit these slaves off their plantations. So about 120 or 30 guys from Lauderdale County served in the 111th and 110th and 111th United States colored troops, and they will have service records, and a lot of them have pension application files. In 1865, the Confederate government, near the end of the war, when it was nearly too late to make any difference, authorized the creation of several all-black combat regiments, like they were called Confederate States colored troops. They were like the United States colored troops, only it was in the South. They saw limited service. However, these guys will have service records. However, estimates are that anywhere from 15 to 30,000 African American men, slave and free, served behind Confederate lines in various different capacities in Confederate labor battalions, as cooks, teamsters, hospital orderlies, musicians, occasionally sharpshooters. Most of these men, a lot of them went as body servants or camp slaves. Men, most often an officer, but not always an officer, would bring a slave with them to help him dress, to take care of his horse, to cook his meals. So these camp slaves or body servants won't have service records. However, some former Confederate states did award pensions to eligible black body servants. Alabama, unfortunately, never did this. That would have been too simple. So don't be dismayed if you find a Confederate ancestor of color. It doesn't mean they were fighting for slavery. They signed up for lots of different reasons. Some of them they had no choice, but when master says go, we got to go. Some were patriotic towards their home state. Some hoped that if the South won the war, they'd get increased rights and privileges if they fought for the South. A lot of reasons these guys served. So it may make you a little bit uncomfortable at first, but you may find guys like that. You got to work to find these guys a little bit harder than you do some of the Union. And this is what actual service records for African Americans look like.
What that bottom piece say that remarks free from?
It says he was a free person of color. Means he was an African American who was not enslaved at the time he enlisted. So they noted that on his service records. But he was Confederate. And of course, the first one, it says Alexander, a free Negro. So he was free as well. And sometimes mixed race slaves, mulatto enslaved people that could pass as white just to get off the plantation would enlist in the Confederate Army. Sometimes they got caught, sometimes not. One woman enslaved person who was mixed race enlisted in the Confederate Army out of Mississippi, and it was 2 or 3 years before they found her out. So strange things happen in the world of genealogy, and especially Civil War genealogy. If you did have a Civil War ancestor, if you can't find service records or whatever, you might try local newspapers, which the Florence Gazette is online from October 1858 to like February of March 1863. And the Gazette often published rosters of soldiers that were being formed and departed. This is Robert McFarland's 4th Alabama, Captain McFarland's regiment, infantry regiment from the 4th Alabama, which was raised in Florence. So this is from May 8th, 1861, and it lists the officers up here, then the enlisted guys. So this could supplement what you already have, or this could lead you to service records if you didn't already know somebody was a Civil War ancestor. Well, they also published casualty reports from major battles. This is the casualty report after the Battle of First Manassas, where somebody, I think it might have been Judge Posey, wrote in about the casualties after the Battle of First Manassas, because Judge Sidney Cherry Posey from Lauderdale County had a son killed he died as a result of wounds after the Battle of First Manassas in a Confederate hospital in Virginia. And you can see they list the wounded and deceased. So this was really good to find that, because it's how I knew John was killed. And John's service records actually have a letter his father wrote on his behalf. First, trying to get him an officer's commission, which he was offered in 1861 when the war started. But John said, it's not ever going to get to a war. If it is, it'll be over too quick. So he turned down his officer's commission. Then when the war finally did start, I should have taken that officer's commission. So his dad tried to get him one, but it was turned down. His service record file also had noted that he had died in there. There's a letter from John's father noting his death in his Civil War service file. Now this is I forgot I had this in there. This is from the Confederate Veteran magazine, which I have one on the table, which was a magazine started by and for Confederate veterans in 1893. We've got the reprints from 1891 all the way up through like 1932. So on and they're indexed. A lot of local guys are in this. This is a Confederate camp slave or body servant named Uncle Ned Buchanan, who has a biographical sketch in the Confederate Veteran. And then the other one, this is a notice from the Florence Times of May 19th, 1911, talking about 2 African-American former body servants or cooks who were going to the Confederate Veterans Reunion in Little Rock, Reuben Patterson and Alec Jones. They were one of 18 men of color from Lauderdale County that went to Confederate Veterans Reunions after the war. So you got to hunt for these, but if you had a Southern ancestor that might have been involved in the Civil War, you don't want to turn down. You don't want to leave any stone unturned trying to research them. They could be Union, they could be Confederate. And I helped one white gentleman do his Civil War research 20 years ago, and he was a Caucasian. His white ancestor had started out in the Confederate Army, got captured, given the choice of going to prison or enlisted in the Union Army. So he chose to enlist in the Union Army. After the war, for a while, he was drawing pensions from the Confederate state of Alabama, former Confederate state of Alabama, and the federal government, until one or both of them figured out this is not supposed to be happening. So they dropped his money really quick. So you could have had a guy that served in both armies. Here are the service records from Private Charles Ingram. He was one of those 120 or 30 enslaved men, in his case, from the Ingram plantation of near Rogersville. Charles served in Company I of the 111th United States Colored Troops. And note that the first card, you can't really read it, on the left gives Ingram's birthday and a physical description. The other card summarizes military service, which in this case includes being restored to duty without pay after deserting. And deserting could simply mean that he just wasn't there when they took the roll. A lot of guys, not ever having been in the military before, especially in the southern armies, said, hey, it's time to go do the spring planting. Or I've got a wife and kids sick at home with rheumatic fever. I'll be back when I get business taken care of. Not realizing the Army can shoot you for that. So they would just leave and come back. Yes, John?
You talked about they couldn't get pensions from both armies. How about those Confederate soldiers that were captured and became galvanized Yankees and went out west to fight Indians?
Yeah.
Could they get double pensions?
That is interesting. I don't know, probably not, unless, it flew under the radar and nobody picked up on it.
Well,
I'll have to look at that. That's a good question.
It would probably depend on if they stayed loyal to the Confederates up until the end of the war.
Because I know after the Civil War, it was really hard. If you had been a Confederate officer of, I think, colonel or higher, you had to take an oath of allegiance to the federal government and actually get a pardon from President Johnson before you could even vote again. The lower grades, they just gave them a blanket amnesty. But we've got, the library has the presidential pardon for one of the Beckwith men who was a Confederate officer. And he had to get a pardon from President Johnson. So, yeah, it's weird how some of this stuff works out. But I would think I was talking about desertion. That could mean, like when Miles Ingram was another guy in the Company H of the 111th United States Colored Troops. They were at the Battle of Sulphur Trestle, and I'm pretty sure Miles Ingram Anthony Brannan. Anthony was captured, but his service records report him as deserted. And I talked to Greg Gresham about this, who's a Civil War expert. And he thinks that that's the military's way of saying he wasn't there when we took the road. It doesn't mean he ran away. It just means he got captured and nobody knew where he was. So desertion was the technical word they used for someone who's not there when they should be. So if you see deserted on somebody's Civil War records, it doesn't necessarily mean they ran away. It could mean they had a sick relative at home, they went home to do some planting and came back, or that they got captured, as on this record of Charles Ingram. Well, in 1890, some of the Union states took an 1890 Union veteran census. So this is French Hollis's cousin, John Bell Hollis, who served with him in Company B of the 2nd Tennessee Mounted Infantry as a second sergeant. The Hollis boys lived in Wayne County, Tennessee up until 1910 or so. And now these censuses were ostensibly just for Union veterans, but they picked up a lot of Confederate veterans by accident, because either they didn't know any better or the people that responded didn't know any better. So you might have a Confederate ancestor that got picked up in this Union veteran census. And I mentioned the Confederate veteran census of 1907 for Alabama. This is my great-great-grandfather Leander Bratcher's brother William. His 1907 Confederate veteran census enumeration from Hines, what is now near Zip City up Chisholm Highway near the state line. The originals are at the courthouse. The library has the microfilm, and these are on fold 3. Probably on fold 3, but I know they're on Ancestry. Well, we talked a little bit about pensions. This is pages from Mrs. Rosanna Giss Ingram's 1897 widow's pension application file. her husband Miles was in Company H of the 111th USCT with Anthony Brannon, and Miles died in 1890, and this family was dirt poor. So Rosanna applied for a widow's pension, and I did some research for a neighbor of my parents, Mrs. Eva Webster, who died. She and her husband have been deceased for several years now, but she said, I want to research my Civil War ancestry. At first, she thought he was Confederate. Well, it turns out he's buried at Bailey's Chapel with a Union military marker. So I ordered the pension application file from her from Broadfoot Publishing, and it was like 150 pages. It was great. So as Brian said, order these pensions from these companies or from the National Archives, because this one was a gold mine. So I've got a couple of the pages on there where Rosanna had to give depositions, her parents gave depositions, her cousins gave depositions on her behalf, her friends and relatives, her pastor, where she mentions in there that she's poor, she has a tumble-down shack. The land they bought was fertile when they bought it, but it won't produce anymore. I mean, if anybody was dirt poor and deserved a pension, it was these people. It also had Rosanna's death certificate in there from the state of Oklahoma. Around 1910, well, after the 1910 census, Rosanna Ingram moved to Oklahoma, where some of her children had moved. And one of her sons, named King David Ingram, they were big on biblical names, for several years was an inmate in a mental institution in Taft, Oklahoma, and he managed to get his mother's pension checks diverted to his account until Rosanna suddenly stopped getting her pension checks. So her granddaughter writes to the pension examiner and says, hey, my grandma is a poor widow and she's not getting her pension application money, and we're pretty sure it's because her son, my uncle, has got them diverted to his post office box in Taft, Oklahoma, and he's not of sound mind, so please give my grandmother her pension checks back. So there's a letter from the Red Cross to the pension examiner saying Mrs. Ingram is a poor widow. Her son is getting her pension checks and he shouldn't, so please send them back to her. So that was one thing we found out from the pension application file. We found out also that Rosanna's house was destroyed in the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 because there was a note in there asking the pension examiner to send her another pension card because hers got destroyed when her house got burned up in the Tulsa Race Massacre. And finally, it had her death certificate in there, which I was really excited to find. This was proof to the pension examiners that she was deceased, so don't send anybody her money. Not her and not her son and not anybody else, because this lady is deceased. So these pension application files can be gold mines. This document lists all of Rosanna's children, their birth dates, month and years they were born. There is deposition in there which tells you how many acres of land they had, how much they paid for it when Miles bought it. It has interviews by family and friends. There's one of Rosanna's cousins said, yeah, I was going with her husband Miles before they got married, but she cut me out and he married her. So you can get a little bit of gossip in these things too. So
they was having drama like that back then?
Oh yeah, there's nothing new under the sun. Jerry Springer ain't invented nothing. If you read some of those divorce decrees from Tennessee from like 1750 to 18 whatever, it sounds like Jerry Springer, only with archaic language. So there's nothing new under the sun. One further source you can use is the official record of the War of the Rebellion, which is this 130, 40 odd volume set of official records compiled by the War Department between the 1880s and like 1910 or so. It has an index volume, which this is. A lot of these are online. This can be a good way to track a company and regiment that your ancestor might have served in, Union or Confederate. If he's a lowly private, he might not get a mention, but if he's notorious like Mountain Tom Clark, he might show up as Tom does in this official March 1st to 6th, 1865 report of Colonel Lot Abraham of the 4th Iowa Cavalry, United States, which they were stationed in and around Lauderdale County. They mentioned Tom Clark, his brother Bishop Clark, and Elias Thrasher. And a delegation from Florence went to Lieutenant Abraham, or Colonel Abraham, and said, several citizens told me they believed most of the robbing had been done by men who were with Lieutenant Thrasher, or men from about Clifton, Tennessee. They all say Thrasher is an honorable man, but blame him for having such men with him. Tom and Bishop Clark, Tom Dennis, Paul Ketty, Bill Bridges, and Pete Grimes are the names of some of his party. A man calling himself Philip seems to be the worst character. So these are worth going through too. My colleague Jordan reads these for fun. I think Greg Gresham probably does too. But these can pay off. They have troop movements, battle reports, casualties. Brian?
And Lee mentioned that if your ancestor was a lowly private, they might not be mentioned in those books. However, it'll tell you a lot about what the different units did.
Yep.
So if you know that your ancestor served in Unit A from January 1st to December 31st of a particular year, and you look in those books and you see what that unit was doing during that year, you can bet your bottom dollar that your ancestor did all those different things, experienced all those different things, etc. And it'll tell you a lot about the life of your ancestor.
And after the war, some of the men from these companies and regiments wrote regimental histories. In a lot of cases, they'll name the men they remembered in their outfits. Some of the officers wrote regimental histories in reports of major battles. If your ancestor was in the Sons of Confederate Veterans or the United Confederate Veterans, they kept really good records. We'll talk a little bit about the Grand Army of the Republic, the Veterans Organization for Union guys. They kept records. One source that people often don't think about that you can sometimes get gold mines of information from is the Southern Claim Commission files. This was a court set up by the federal government in 1871 to reimburse loyalist Southerners during the Civil War who had property confiscated by the Union Army. This court was set up so if you could prove to the Southern Claims Commission that you had been a loyalist to the Union Army during the Civil War from the South, you could get reimbursed. So you basically had to go to court, swear out depositions, they'd interview witnesses. The court never gave people what they asked for, so people realized pretty early on, if you had $2,000 worth of goods taken, ask for $4,000. They ain't going to give you $4,000, but they'll give you less than what you ask for. So always ask for more and you'll get what you need. Well, a lot of African American formerly enslaved people and free people of color also submitted these petitions. This is a slide from a free person of color, a barber named James Goen, who before he came to Lauderdale County with his wife and 2 kids, he later had 2 more sons. After the war, they came to Lauderdale County from Lawrence County, Alabama around 1857, and James was a barber. When the Civil War broke out, James wasn't barbering, but he was working for James Jackson Jr. of the Forks of Cypress in his livery stable. James Jackson Jr., we know this from his Southern Claim petition. James Jackson Jr. actually helped this free African American James Goen hide from the Confederate conscripts. They were rounding up slaves and free people of color to send them down to South Alabama to build barricades, earthworks, and stuff like that. So James Jackson Jr., who was a colonel in the 27th Alabama, actually helped James Goen hide out. James Goen claimed to be a Unionist. He claimed he helped a Union female spy evade Union capture, but under oath, in his deposition, he had to admit that he served for 3 months in 1861 as the cook for a Confederate regiment. He served in Robert McFarland's 4th Alabama, I believe Company I or Company H, as the cook. He was hired by Washington Foster. And basically the pension examiners go, Mr. Goen, I can't imagine how a Unionist and a man of color could voluntarily go down with the Confederate or go up with the Confederates into Virginia. Now, what's this all about? You went, they didn't compel you to go, and he basically goes, I went for money. They needed a cook and I needed the $40 a month. I didn't care which whipped myself, and I was at the Battle of First Manassas, but I didn't take up any arms. So he was honest enough to admit, yeah, I served as a cook in a Confederate regiment because I needed the $40 a month. But obviously they're not going to give him they're not going to award him any money, even though he claimed to have been a Unionist. And of course, a couple of people like Judge Thomas T. Allington testified that James Goin had been a spy for the Confederates. So, but anyway, this told me that he served for 3 months as a cook in a Confederate regiment because he got $40 a month. And so you can get a lot of really good information on your ancestor, white or black, if they filed a claim with the if they filed a petition with the Southern Claims Commission. Again, Unionists, at least people that claim to be Unionists. And this guy, Elias Thrasher, also, he was a second lieutenant of Company B, 2nd Tennessee Mounted Infantry, which the Hollis boys were in, from which Tom Clark and 2 of his brothers deserted and became thieves and outlaws. Second Lieutenant Thrasher and his father both got lots of money from the federal government. I think his father got like $800 and some change from the Southern Claims Commission. And I can't remember, I think Thrasher got between $400 and $600 from the commission. In his Southern Claims petition file, which these records are available on Fold 3, which the library has a subscription to, I found these March 28, 1865 special orders ordering Elias Thrasher to Lauderdale County for the purpose of, quote, breaking up an encampment of guerrillas, unquote, and, quote, unquote, obtaining results. So he was sent to clean out the Confederate version of Tom Clark, who had deserted from his own regiment. And Jordan has found out from reading these Southern Claims petitions that for the right price, Thrasher would testify on anybody's behalf. And he got known for being the go-to guy. If you could pay him, he was the go-to guy to help you further your Southern Claim petition, because he'd be your witness if you could afford to pay him. Of course, he died peacefully at his sister's house in Christmas of 1900. But I get a lot of good information about him, such as that he initially formed his own company and regiment, but then I guess he says in his notes, in his deposition, tired of the burdens of command, he resigned that commission, and he later was appointed second lieutenant in Company B of the 2nd Tennessee Mounted Infantry. But it gives me a little bit more insight into his Civil War service. So he also had a pension application file where he got an $8 a month invalid's pension after the war, which $8 a month was big money. He tried to get it increased to like $16 or something, because he says he contracted jaundice during the war, but the medical examiners weren't buying that, so he didn't get any increased money. And I didn't mention Confederate pensions. I need to say a little bit about Confederate pensions, and then we'll start wrapping it up. The Union pensions are probably generally a lot better than the Confederate pension application files, although they do exist. Ancestry has some of the Confederate pension files. And again, to receive a pension from either side, a veteran had to meet certain eligibility requirements. He had to prove that he was disabled or otherwise unable to support himself due to injuries or illnesses sustained during his military service. But even if a veteran's application for a pension was denied, he would still have a file. They basically had to go before the pension examiner. The medical examiner, if he claims he's injured and can't support himself, the medical examiner has to say, yes, he is handicapped and cannot support himself. As we said for Rosanna, the Union ones tend to be a lot thicker. They can have stuff like his company regiment, his dates of enlistment, his wife's and children's names, date of their marriage, names and birth date of their children, his date of discharge, any physical ailments or disabilities. There'll be signed affidavits by friends and relatives who testified on his behalf. And I had a guy named Jeter Boyd, who was an in-law of my Bratchers from Wayne County. Him and a bunch of his buddies who had served in the Union Army out of Wayne County all applied for Union pensions on the same day, same time, same place. the pension examiners, and I think we need to investigate these guys because they all showed up at the same time and they use each other as witnesses. I don't think they were trying to put one over on the government. They just thought the government's giving out free money, let's go get some. Wasn't quite that simple. With the Confederate pensions, the federal government required the former Confederate states to pay their pensioners in their own states. However, by the late 1940s, the federal government had assumed the duty of paying out Confederate pensions for the handful of guys that were still left. Each different Confederate state began awarding pensions at different dates. A veteran was able to apply for a pension in the state in which he lived, even if he had served initially in a regiment from a different state. Now, few former Confederate states awarded pensions to eligible former African American body servants or camp slaves. Mississippi in 1883, Tennessee in 1921, South Carolina in 1925, Virginia in 1924, and North Carolina in 1927. So we have the state archives of the various former Confederate states hold the original pension application files. We have some of the 1890s Confederate pension application files for Lauderdale County on microfilm upstairs. In February of 1867, Alabama began granting pensions to veterans who had lost arms or legs. In 1886, the state began awarding pensions to veterans' widows, and in 1891, they amended the law in order to grant pensions to indigent veterans or their widows. So there were basically three classes of Confederate pensions in Alabama. Class 1 was soldiers and sailors who were over 80 years of age or totally blind or who had lost 2 limbs or the entire use thereof. By 1902, a Class 1 pensioner received a quarterly payment of $43.30. A Class 2 pension was someone who had lost a leg, foot, arm, or hand or the entire use thereof or were over 70 years of age. By 1903, a Class 2 pensioner received a quarterly payment of $36.10 a year. Class 3 was all others entitled to relief not covered in Classes 1 and 2. By 1902, a Class 3 pensioner received quarterly payments of $28.85 a month. So, Union pensions were a little bit different than Confederate pensions. I'm not going to say a lot about Spanish-American War and Philippine insurrection records. The compiled service records for 1,235 Rough Riders are online at the KRA website. Service records for volunteer units serving in the Philippine insurrection of 1899 to 1902 will be found in the Spanish-American compiled service records, while those designated U.S. volunteer will be found in the Philippine insurrection compiled service records. These records, for the most part, have not been microfilmed or digitized yet, so you got to write to the National Archives. I will mention that Lauderdale County had at least one company of our local militia regiment that got sent to the Spanish-American War, and I think maybe one to the Philippines. But we did have some Spanish-American War veterans. So this is the service records of one of those guys, Arthur E. Carter, who after the Spanish-American War, well, he had served with Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders during the war, and he was later a member of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show before he was a member of the Panama Canal Police Force, and he's buried right over here in the city cemetery. Most of the World War I and II service records, unfortunately, records for military personnel are restricted for 62 years for privacy reasons to the veteran, his next of kin, or a requester with the proper authorization. This includes Vietnam, the Gulf War, and the Iraq War, World Wars I. Well, it did. The World War I and II records that are still available are open now. World War I, World War II, and Korean records are available to all researchers. These records are housed at the National Personnel Records Center. However, in 1973, at the NPRC in St. Louis, a fire destroyed approximately 16 to 18 million of these records. So if you had a World War I, World War II ancestor, chances are their service records got taken out by that fire. The government can sometimes reconstruct these records from alternate sources. So it might be worth logging into the NARA website and filling the form out anyway and sending it in to see what they can do. And there will be a fee. So any records that still exist are held at the National Military Personnel Record Center in St. Louis, Missouri. What you can get in many cases for an ancestor, you can also check local newspapers. If you had a World War I ancestor, this is an article from September 13th, 1918, noting that Mrs. Martha J. Freeman, my great-grandmother, had 3 sons in the military, so she was what they called the Gold Star Mother. Luckily, all 3 of her sons survived the war. My grandpa Alan and his brother Vernon, they served in France. Emery had just finished basic when the armistice was signed, so he didn't actually have to go. But this newspaper article, if I hadn't already known it, told me that my grandpa Alan served with 2 of his brothers in the military. But then you can get draft registration cards on Ancestry. That's my grandpa Freeman in France with some of his buddies. So this is the first page of his draft registration card. Doesn't mean just because they filled out a draft registration card doesn't mean they got called up to serve, but they had to fill a card out. So these are available on Ancestry, the National Archives. I think the branch office over in Atlanta has the actual cards, but you can get copies off of Ancestry, and it'll give you the veteran's name, his race, his birth date, where he lives, his address, his occupation, his nearest relative to contact if he gets killed or dies during his service.
May we have your attention, please? The time is now 4:30. In 30
Just about
minutes, the
done.
Florence Lauderdale Public Library will close at 5 o'clock. Please be aware that all public computers will shut down automatically 15 minutes before closing at 4:45. Thank you.
You can also find veterans' names in newspapers. If you're not sure whether somebody served or not, you can check these rosters. The Florence Herald is online through newspapers.com, and it's indexed. We have a subscription to it. That's where I got this one. But notice they published the names of the white guys that were going away for basic, and then the African-American guys that were going away for basic. So you might not get service records on any or all of these guys, but at least you'd know they served. And a lot of the veterans were in organizations after the war, like the Veterans of Foreign Wars or the American Legion. They keep records. The Lauderdale County Courthouse has the discharge book for Lauderdale County World War I veterans, because I have it for my grandpa. So that's it for military service records, and that's it for the seminar. If anybody has any quick questions, I'll let Brian take a few minutes just to talk about the Natchez Trace Society and our upcoming seminar. And then BC Clemens, I'll give him a few seconds to talk about his YouTube history channel. And then